So we're starting to get a little more of a thoughtful sense about energy and microgrids and resilience from Jack's discussion. When we started this conversation, largely about 5 years ago in the Pentagon, it was about the same time Hurricane Sandy hit, but also there were a lot of Pentagon leaders talking about the need to, say, island our military bases, because my gosh, you know, that's something that we really think is important. And so then we started to have some conversation within the building and beyond about issues. Number one, what is this resilience thing and how do I know if I have it? And what's it worth and how am I going to pay for it? And then number two, what about this islanding idea? Because it sounds great, except, you know, your power actually came from off base, your water came from off base, your workers live off base, security has off base agreements. And so what Mr. Suresh just started to, you know, highlight is that you can't just look inside the fence line. It's a collaborative community sort of thing, and we need to think about what are we trying to achieve. So Erik has done a lot of work on a lot of these issues, and so he's going to talk about how do we think about this resilience thing and maybe strategies to do something about it. Thank you.
The purpose for microgrids, you know, is partly for energy savings. It's partly for handling reliability events or short duration outages, but you know, for the DoD, microgrids are being looked at, you know, more and more for providing long-term power for you know, long-term outages. And so when we look at Hurricane Sandy, you look at events down in Houston, we're seeing outages in some areas up to 2 weeks, and now in Puerto Rico, unfortunately, it'll be even longer. So I want to take a step back and take a look at how energy and emergency response interact and how that could inform some of our planning. So I took a look at you know, how do we do emergency response? You know, the traditional approach, very simply, is that we, you know, evacuate people from the affected area out, and we send our responders from the outside in. And that has worked traditionally for disasters, but for larger catastrophes, that starts to break down. So there are about 100 to 300,000 people not evacuated from New Orleans during Katrina. I actually had a fraternity brother die while waiting to be evacuated from a hospital during Katrina. And prior to Hurricane Rita, they evacuated Houston. Despite having contraflow traffic and staged evacuations, 78 people died in their vehicles in the resulting gridlock. And my guess is that's why they didn't evacuate Houston this time around, because of that lesson. So my argument is that our existing emergency response approach does not scale up as our disasters get larger and longer. So I did a thought exercise. What would happen if we had a long duration power outage for whatever reason on the eastern seaboard? You know, say the 2003 blackout, but longer. How long would it take to evacuate my home state of Massachusetts? Well, if you assume all sorts of rosy scenarios, 4 people per car, contraflow traffic, no law and order incidents, no breakdowns on the highways, evacuating west, it would take 10 days to evacuate the eastern part of the state. So that is obviously not a practicable or tractable solution. When I presented this to our director, he noticed that he lives right around there, so he he started planning. Now, how does that interact with infrastructure, right? You know, when a disaster happens, the emergency response, the emergency managers and the utility operators, they get in the emergency operations center together. But prior to that, how much planning is there in terms of restoration, interdependent infrastructure restoration? You know, my impression, based on speaking with a number of organizations, is that each utility has its own restoration priority list. The emergency management agencies have their plans for evacuation. You know, FEMA looks at hurricane evacuation maps and zones. But from what I've gathered is that there is relatively little pre-coordination across interdependent infrastructure, except in the days immediately after an event. So if we look at all the large-scale infrastructure in Massachusetts, natural gas transmission pipelines, compressor stations, major generation stations, transmission lines, and water treatment stations, you know, this is an overlay on the map. And say we identified what I'm calling enclaves. Right now these are just bubbles on the map. There may be hundreds of smaller ones. There may be larger ones. But how would that interact with the emergency evacuation plan? We could get our emergency evacuation time potentially down to 24 hours if we enable shelter in place and allow people to evacuate into those areas. Imagine how the story would be if this were the case in Puerto Rico. And again, this is just notional, the amount of infrastructure we would have to restore if we had that pre-established priority restoration corridors. We identified what are the critical loads in each one of those enclaves, are they served from the distribution level to the transmission level, where is the fuel coming from for those transmission level assets. The amount of infrastructure we would have to restore instead of trying to restore largely everything simultaneously would be significantly reduced. So, all right, Eric, this sounds great. This sounds expensive. How are we going to build up an enclave that size? Let's zoom in on one area. Say this is a major urban area. We've been working with the city of Boston on identifying locations for microgrids, or if we went to a DoD installation. We've done about 16 site assessments around the world for DoD at various installations using a methodology that we developed. It's fairly straightforward, but we've been able to test some hypotheses. So one assumption that vendors have stated to the DoD is that if you want energy resilience, you're going to have to pay more for it. So we want to test that assumption. The other assumption was if you want energy resilience to a long duration outage, you're going to have to pay a lot more for that. So we want to test that assumption as well. So we go to a site, we look at where the critical loads are, where the substations are, which areas of the base those substations serve. We look at, this is very high level, but we look at where the existing generation assets are, on-site diesel storage and diesel generators. We look at where the distribution lines are. And we then meet with the base energy managers and the mission owners. And we'll start the meeting with looking over the defense critical infrastructure list, and then also the service level critical infrastructure list. And in many cases, that's the first time the base energy managers have seen that list and been exposed to what are some of the truly critical missions on their installation. So once we've identified what those critical loads are, we've developed models of a number of different assets, so grid-tied solar, ionable solar, cogeneration, microgrid islanding capabilities, different types of battery systems, a whole host of different components. And we've got reliability models for those components. We then put together something like 100 different power system architectures for that site, different combinations of those components. We'll do a Monte Carlo simulation. We'll either look at historical outages, say 2 hours a couple times a year, or we'll look at how the system would respond under a long duration outage. We then also have a financial model which allows us to calculate the total life cycle cost of energy. So how much would the base pay for its electricity, as well as the maintenance of all those assets, including emergency assets. And then based on results we'll show, we can then come up with a recommendation for different power system architectures. So again, this is to test this assumption that you need to pay a significant premium for energy resilience. So let me walk you through this chart. The x-axis shows the different power system architectures, and we have a number for them. So architecture number 1 is purely grid electricity. Architecture number 2 is their existing solution, which is emergency diesel generators at many of the buildings. And when we go to these sites, we see that there's a large number of diesel generators. There was one site we visited, they had 300 emergency diesel generators, and they had 3 staff responsible for maintaining those and doing their 1 hour a month test. It's a real maintenance, and once an outage happens, a logistical challenge to keep those things fueled up. So architecture number 1, architecture number 2, and we have the different architectures as well. Top chart shows total life cycle cost. That's for both for buying the electricity as well as maintaining the system. And the bottom chart shows our metric for energy resilience. How much of the critical load does that architecture serve during the outages that we've defined? So the closer to zero, the better the energy resilience is of that system. We're just looking at the critical mission loads. So this is unserved load. And you can see that there are a number of architectures that are both lower cost and more resilient than what the DoD is currently doing for each one of those sites. And significantly lower cost and significantly more resilient than what they're currently doing. Now, this was a 90 megawatt site using available fuel reserves, looking at historic outages. What about for a long duration outage, a black sky scenario? We looked at no off-site maintenance, no off-site fuel resupply, 14-day outages, and we noticed two things. First of all, if you had picked the lowest cost solution here, the lowest cost, most resilient solution, you would have picked wrong because that system would actually do just about as well as the diesel generators. But there are a couple of architectures, including microgrids and islandable solar, that would provide significant resilience, significant ability to serve critical loads during a extended 14-day outage at approximately equal or slightly higher cost than what the DoD is currently paying for its diesel generator solution. So obviously there are a lot of deployment challenges. These are not simple systems, but our argument, our conclusion from this analysis is that correct system design can make our DoD installations much more resilient to long duration outages at similar to or lower cost than what they're currently doing. So, grid faces a range of threats. I think we need to fundamentally rethink the way we're doing emergency response planning and energy infrastructure investments. I think those two need to be tied together. I think grid operators, natural gas system operators, emergency managers need to be planning interdependent infrastructure restoration ahead of time and exercising those plans. Our analysis shows that sites can become resilient to long duration outages at marginal additional cost. Thank you.